Sir, whose vehicle is this? I need you to explain what you're doing here.
This is my vehicle. I'm just getting gas. Is there a problem?
I'm investigating a stolen vehicle report,
Officer,
and you match
I'm
the
running late
description.
for work. I'm Judge Reuben Pierce, Federal District Court. My courthouse is 3 blocks away, and I have a hearing starting in 20 minutes.
A judge? Dressed like that?
I've
This
been on the
courtroom
federal
full of
bench for
authority
22 years.
Call chambers. They'll tell you who I am.
We'll sort out who you really are at the station. Stop talking.
I have a hearing.
The federal courthouse at 601 Market Street in Philadelphia was 3 blocks from the Chevron station, where Judge Reuben Pierce stopped to fill his gas tank on the morning of October the 16th, 2024, already running 15 minutes late for an emergency hearing in a case involving police use of excessive force. But Officer Michael Stone didn't know about the courthouse proximity or the hearing or the irony of what he was about to do when he saw a black man in a black robe next to an expensive car and decided he'd found the luxury vehicle thief the department had been looking for since the overnight report. Stone's 8 years of targeting black drivers in expensive cars had taught him to trust his assumptions over evidence. So when the man explained he was a federal judge, Stone heard a criminal's lie rather than a simple truth he could have verified with a single phone call or a quick look at the federal court website. He detained the judge, searched his car, and treated his desperate explanations about needing to get to court as evidence of guilt rather than as the legitimate urgency of someone whose courtroom was waiting. What he didn't know was that the briefcase he was searching contained case files for the hearing that would start without the judge, that the costume he was mocking was official judicial attire recognized in every courtroom in America, and that within 20 minutes, a junior attorney from the delayed hearing would pull into the same gas station and recognize a judge being handcuffed, triggering a chain of events that would end with Stone facing criminal charges for falsely arresting a federal judge based purely on racial bias so obvious that even his own department couldn't defend it. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. If you believe that judicial robes deserve recognition, not suspicion, then hit the like and subscribe button here on JPTV. Judge Reuben Pierce left his home in the Chestnut Hill neighborhood of Philadelphia at 7:42 a.m., already behind schedule for a hearing that was supposed to start at 8:30 a.m. in his courtroom at the James A. Byrne U.S. Courthouse on Market Street. He was 54 years old, a federal judge for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania with 22 years on the bench. He'd been appointed by a Democratic president, confirmed by a bipartisan Senate vote, and had built a reputation as a thoughtful, fair jurist whose rulings were rarely overturned on appeal. This morning's hearing was particularly important because it involved a civil rights lawsuit against the Philadelphia Police Department, alleging excessive force during an arrest that had left a man with permanent injuries. The case had drawn media attention, and the courtroom would be packed with attorneys, plaintiffs, defendants, and observers waiting to see how Pierce would rule on several critical motions that could determine whether the case went to trial. Pierce had planned to arrive at the courthouse by 8:00 a.m. to review his notes one final time, but his morning had been disrupted by a call from his elderly mother about a medical appointment she needed help scheduling, and the conversation had run longer than expected. By the time he'd gotten dressed in his judicial robes at home to save time, once he reached the courthouse, he was running late. He drove his charcoal gray 2022 Mercedes-Benz S-Class, a car he'd purchased 2 years ago after his previous vehicle had finally given out after 15 years of service. The Mercedes was expensive, but not ostentatious, the kind of vehicle that reflected his professional success without being flashy. It was registered in his name, insured properly, and had never been involved in any incidents beyond a minor fender bender in a parking lot 3 years ago that had been completely his fault. As he drove down Germantown Avenue towards Center City, his gas light came on. He'd meant to fill up the night before, but had forgotten, and now he was looking at maybe 20 miles of range left. The courthouse was 8 miles away, which should have been fine, but Pierce didn't like cutting it that close. He spotted the Chevron station at 1847 Market Street, just 3 blocks from the courthouse, and pulled in at 8:03 a.m. He was wearing his full judicial robes because he'd put them on at home, thinking he'd save time by walking straight into the courthouse, ready to take the bench. The black robe was formal and unmistakable, the kind worn by federal judges across the country with his name embroidered subtly on the inside collar. He got out of his car, inserted his credit card at the pump, and began filling his tank while checking his phone for messages from his law clerk, Angela Morrison, about whether the attorneys had all arrived. What Pierce didn't know was that at 2:17 a.m. DM that morning, a luxury sedan had been stolen from a Mercedes dealership in North Philadelphia. The report that went out to patrol officers described it as a dark-colored luxury sedan, possibly Mercedes or BMW, stolen from dealership lot. Suspect unknown. The description was vague because the theft had been discovered when the dealership opened, and security footage was still being reviewed. Officer Michael Stone had been on patrol since 6:00 a.m. working the day shift for the Philadelphia Police Department's Central Division. He was 37 years old, an 8-year veteran who'd spent most of his career in patrol assignments across Center City and surrounding neighborhoods. His personnel file showed he was an active officer who made regular stops and arrests, but it also contained 9 complaints over 8 years alleging racial profiling and harassment of black drivers in expensive vehicles. The complaints told a consistent story. Stone would pull over black drivers in luxury cars for minor violations or no violation at all, then subject them to extended questioning about vehicle ownership, employment, and how they could afford the cars they were driving. He'd search vehicles based on vague claims of suspicious behavior and had been accused multiple times of assuming any black person in an expensive car must have stolen it or purchased it with drug money. All 9 complaints had been investigated internally and dismissed with findings that Stone had operated within department guidelines and officer discretion. When the stolen Mercedes report came over the radio at 7:15 a.m., Stone had made it his mission to look for it, and his interpretation of looking for it meant scrutinizing every luxury car with a black driver he encountered. He'd already pulled over 2 vehicles that morning. A BMW driven by a black businessman heading to work, and a Lexus driven by a black woman taking her kids to school. And both stops had ended with no violations found and irritated citizens filing complaints that would eventually be dismissed like all the others. At 8:05 a.m., Stone pulled into the Chevron station on Market Street to grab coffee before finishing his shift. And that's when he saw Pierce standing by the gas pump in his judicial robes next to a dark gray Mercedes S-Class. In Stone's mind, the image didn't compute correctly. He saw a black man in what looked like a long black robe or costume next to an expensive car that matched the general description of the stolen vehicle. And his 8 years of racial profiling told him he'd found something suspicious. He didn't see a federal judge in official judicial attire. He didn't consider that a gas station 3 blocks from a federal courthouse might logically have judges as customers. He didn't think about the fact that someone stealing a car probably wouldn't stop to fill it with gas on a credit card. His bias processed the scene as black man, expensive car, unusual clothing that must be a disguise, probable car thief trying to look legitimate. Stone got out of his patrol car and walked toward Pierce with his hand resting on his weapon. Pierce noticed the officer approaching and assumed it was a casual interaction, maybe the officer recognizing him from court or just being friendly. "Morning, officer," Pierce said, glancing at his watch and seeing it was now 8:07 a.m. He had 23 minutes to finish pumping gas, drive 3 blocks, park, and get to his courtroom. "Sir, I need to see your license and registration." "Whose vehicle is this?" Pierce looked up, surprised by the tone in the question. "It's my vehicle." "Is there a problem? License and registration now." Pierce felt a familiar tension settle in his chest because he'd been a black man in America for 54 years, and he recognized the shift in an officer's tone that meant this wasn't going to be quick or easy. "Officer, I'm running late for work. Can you tell me what this is about? I'm investigating a stolen vehicle report. I need to verify this car belongs to you." "It does belong to me. I'm Judge Reuben Pierce, Federal District Court. My courthouse is 3 blocks away and I have a hearing starting in 20 minutes. Stone looked at Pierce's robes and his expression showed clear disbelief. "You're a judge dressed like that?" "Yes. These are judicial robes. I'm a federal judge and I'm late for court." "Right, and I'm the president. License and registration. Last time I'm asking nicely." Pierce walked to his car and retrieved his wallet and registration, his hands steady despite his growing anger and anxiety about the time. He handed both documents to Stone, and they clearly showed his name, his address in Chestnut Hill, and the fact that the Mercedes was registered to Reuben L. Pierce at that same address. Stone looked at the documents with obvious skepticism. "How long have you owned this vehicle?" 2 years. "Officer, please, I really need to get to the courthouse. You can call and verify who I am if you don't believe me. A lot of people make up stories when they get pulled over. What's with the costume?" "It's not a costume, it's a judicial robe. I'm a federal judge. This is what we wear in court." Stone's radio crackled with routine traffic reports, and Pierce checked his phone to see a text from Angela. "Judge, attorneys are all here. Are you close?" It was 8:11 a.m., 19 minutes until his hearing was supposed to start, and he was standing at a gas station being interrogated by an officer who thought his judicial robes were a Halloween costume. "I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle while I verify this information," Stone said, already convinced he'd found something criminal and determined to investigate until he proved it. And Judge Reuben Pierce, who'd spent 22 years presiding over cases in a federal courtroom just 3 blocks away, who'd sentenced criminals and protected constitutional rights, and earned the respect of attorneys across the Eastern District, realized with sinking certainty that his judicial authority meant nothing to an officer who'd already decided a black man in robes next to a Mercedes must be a car thief in a costume. Stone walked back to his patrol car with Pierce's license and registration, and Pierce stood by the gas pump watching the clock on his phone tick from 8:12 to 8:15 to 8:18. His courtroom was 3 blocks away, and his hearing was supposed to start in 12 minutes. He could see the federal courthouse from where he stood, could see the flags flying above the building where his name plate sat on a courtroom door, and his law clerk was probably getting nervous about his absence. Stone ran Pierce's information through the system, and everything came back clean. Valid driver's license, no warrants, no violations, vehicle registered to the name on the license. The Mercedes Vivine didn't match any stolen vehicle reports. Everything was legitimate and legal, exactly as Pierce had said. But Stone had spent 8 years trusting his bias over evidence, and he wasn't going to let clean records change his mind about what he thought he'd found. He got out of his car and walked back to Pierce at 8:21, 9 minutes before the hearing was supposed to start. "Sir, I need to search your vehicle." Pierce felt his composure starting to crack. "On what basis? You've run my information. Everything came back clean. I've told you I'm a federal judge and I'm late for court. Please just let me go. Your story doesn't add up. Nobody dresses like that to go to work. I think you stole this car and you're wearing a costume to try to fool people." "This isn't a costume. I'm a federal judge. Call the courthouse and verify. The number is public information. Just call and ask for Judge Pierce's chambers." Stone's face hardened because he didn't like being told what to do, especially by someone he'd already decided was lying. "Step away from the vehicle. I'm conducting a search. I do not consent to a search. You have no probable cause. Your suspicious behavior and refusal to cooperate give me all the probable cause I need." Pierce's phone buzzed with another text from Angela. "Judge, it's 8:22. Should I tell the attorneys you're delayed?" He tried to answer, but Stone grabbed his phone. "Don't touch your phone during a police interaction. That's my law clerk asking where I am. I have a courtroom full of people waiting for me." Stone ignored him and opened the back door of the Mercedes, starting to search through the interior. He found Pierce's briefcase on the back seat and pulled it out, opening it on the trunk of the car. Inside were case files, legal briefs, court documents, and a laptop. Stone flipped through the papers like he was looking for drugs or stolen property instead of recognizing them as exactly what a judge would carry. A gas station customer named David Santos was filling up his truck 2 pumps over and watching the interaction with growing concern. He pulled out his phone and started recording because what he was seeing looked wrong. A man in what was clearly formal robes being treated like a criminal at a gas station across the street from the federal courthouse. At 8:27, 3 minutes before the hearing was supposed to start, Stone called for backup. "I need another unit at the Chevron on Market Street. I've got a suspicious person who claims to be a judge, but I think he's involved in that stolen Mercedes from this morning." Pierce couldn't believe what he was hearing. "The VIN doesn't match. You ran my registration. Everything is legal. What more do you need? I need to verify that you didn't forge these documents and steal this identity along with the car." Inside the federal courthouse 3 blocks away, Angela Morrison stood outside Judge Pierce's courtroom with a packed gallery of attorneys, plaintiffs, and defendants, all waiting for the hearing to start. She tried calling the judge 5 times, and he wasn't answering. She approached the senior attorney for the plaintiffs and explained that the judge was delayed for unknown reasons. The attorney, Rebecca Chen, was confused because Judge Pierce was known for being punctual and professional. "Should we contact court security? This isn't like him," a second Pollock. A car pulled up to the gas station at 8:31, and now Pierce was surrounded by 2 officers while a third searched his car. Stone was going through his judicial robes, looking for hidden pockets or contraband, treating formal judicial attire like it might contain drugs or weapons. "I'm calling my chambers right now and having my clerk contact your supervisor," Pierce said, reaching for his phone again. Stone stepped forward and grabbed Pierce's wrist. "I told you not to touch your phone. Put your hands behind your back. You're arresting me for what?" "For obstruction and suspicious vehicle operation. We'll sort out who you really are at the station." Pierce felt handcuffs close around his wrists, cold metal against the sleeves of his judicial robes, and the absolute wrongness of the situation hit him fully. He was a federal judge being arrested at a gas station for the crime of being black in an expensive car while wearing the official attire of his profession. David Santos captured everything on his phone, the handcuffs going on, Pierce in his judicial robes standing beside his Mercedes, the officers treating him like a criminal. He kept recording because he knew this was something people would need to see to believe. At 8:34, Rebecca Chen decided she couldn't wait any longer for the judge. She told Angela she was going to grab coffee before the hearing eventually started and walked out of the courthouse toward the Chevron station on Market Street, where she always stopped for her morning coffee. She pulled into the gas station at 8:37 and saw police cars with lights flashing, officers surrounding someone in a crowd of customers watching. She was about to drive past when she saw the man in handcuffs turn slightly, and she recognized his profile immediately. It was Judge Pierce, her judge, the federal judge whose courtroom was waiting for him 3 blocks away in handcuffs at a gas station, surrounded by police who apparently had no idea they just arrested a member of the federal judiciary. Rebecca parked her car and got out, her phone already in her hand to document what she was seeing, and walked toward the officers, who just made a mistake so catastrophic it would end careers and become a case study in how racial profiling can blind people to reality, even when that reality is wearing judicial robes. Rebecca Chen walked directly to the officers with her phone recording and her voice sharp with authority. "I'm attorney Rebecca Chen, and I need you to uncuff Judge Pierce immediately." "That's a federal judge you have in handcuffs." Stone turned to her with irritation. "Ma'am, step back. This doesn't concern you. It absolutely concerns me. I have a hearing scheduled in his courtroom right now at 8:30. That's Judge Reuben Pierce of the U.S. District Court, and you're making him miss a federal court proceeding." Stone looked at Pierce, then at Rebecca, his confidence starting to waver. "She's lying too. They're working together." Rebecca pulled up the federal court website on her phone and turned it towards Stone. The screen showed Judge Pierce's official biography page with his photo, his credentials, his appointment date. The man in the photograph was identical to the man standing in handcuffs wearing judicial robes. That's his official court page. Judge Reuben Pierce, appointed to the federal bench 22 years ago. Look at his face. Look at what he's wearing. Those are judicial robes, not a costume. You just arrested a federal judge. Stone's face went pale as he looked at the website, then at Pierce, then back at the photo. The second officer, who arrived as backup, stepped closer and looked at the screen, and his expression showed he understood immediately what had happened. "Stone, uncuff him now. But the stolen car report, the VIN doesn't match. You already verified that," uncuffed the judge. The handcuffs came off at 8:41, 11 minutes after Pierce's hearing was supposed to have started. Stone's hands were shaking as he removed them, and Pierce rubbed his wrist where the metal had left red marks on his skin. Rebecca was already on her phone calling the courthouse. "Angela, I found Judge Pierce. He's at the Chevron station on Market. The police detained him. We're heading back now." Pierce straightened his robes with as much dignity as he could manage and looked directly at Stone. "Officer, what's your name and badge number?" "Michael Stone, badge 4291. "Officer Stone, you detained and arrested a federal judge for 37 minutes based on nothing but the fact that I'm black and driving a Mercedes. You dismissed my judicial robes as a costume. You refused to verify my identity despite my repeated requests, and you made me miss a federal court hearing involving police misconduct, which is an irony I'm sure won't be lost on anyone when this becomes public. Stone tried to stammer an excuse, but Pierce held up his hand. I'm not interested in your justifications right now. I need to get to my courtroom. Pierce got into his Mercedes and drove the 3 blocks to the courthouse, with Rebecca following in her car. He parked in the judge's garage and walked through the building, still in his robes, with the handcuff marks visible on his wrists. Court security officers who saw him did double takes, recognizing that something was wrong. He entered his courtroom at 8:49, 19 minutes late, and the packed gallery fell silent when they saw him. His robes were wrinkled from the search, his usual composed demeanor was cracked, and everyone could see the red marks on his wrists. Pierce took the bench and looked out at the courtroom. My apologies for the delay. I was detained by Philadelphia police at a gas station 3 blocks from this courthouse. I was searched, handcuffed, and accused of stealing my own vehicle because the officer who stopped me couldn't accept that a black man in judicial robes was actually a federal judge. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The police misconduct case he was about to hear involved excessive force allegations, and now the judge presiding over it had just experienced his own encounter with biased policing. Later that morning, when court security pulled the gas station surveillance footage in Stone's body cam, the evidence was devastating. The video showed Pierce calmly explaining he was a judge, showing his credentials, begging to be allowed to call the courthouse. It showed Stone dismissing everything, calling the robes a costume, searching the car despite no probable cause, and handcuffing a federal judge while saying, "We'll sort out who you really are at the station." Captain Raymond Torres reviewed the footage and pulled Stone's personnel file. 9 complaints in 8 years, all from black drivers and expensive cars, all describing the same pattern Pierce had just experienced. Torres had signed off on dismissing those complaints as unsubstantiated. And now he was watching his officer handcuff a federal judge based on the same racial profiling those complaints had described. The U.S. Marshal Service, which provides security for federal judges, opened an immediate investigation because an assault on a judge's person is a federal matter. The Philadelphia Police Department's Internal Affairs Division launched a parallel investigation, and Judge Pierce filed a formal complaint that went directly to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Stone's defense was that he was investigating a stolen vehicle report, and Pierce matched the vague description, but the body cam showed he'd verified the VIN didn't match, had run Pierce's information and found it clean, and had still proceeded with the search and arrest. The footage showed him calling judicial robes a costume and refusing to make a simple phone call that would have verified Pierce's identity in 30 seconds. Within a week, Stone was arrested and charged with deprivation of civil rights under color of law, false arrest, and official misconduct. Captain Torres was suspended for his pattern of dismissing valid profiling complaints, and the Philadelphia Police Department faced a federal consent decree requiring oversight of all traffic stops to identify racial profiling patterns that supervisors had been ignoring for years. Michael Stone was fired from the Philadelphia Police Department within 2 weeks of the incident, terminated before his criminal trial even began because the city understood that keeping him employed would be indefensible. The body cam footage showing him handcuffing a federal judge in judicial robes while calling the robes a costume played on every news channel, becoming the most clear-cut example of racial profiling many legal experts had ever seen documented. The criminal trial was brief because Stone's defense attorney had no viable strategy when the evidence included video of him dismissing a federal judge's identity, refusing to verify it despite repeated requests, and arresting him based purely on the combination of his race in his car. The jury convicted Stone of deprivation of civil rights and false arrest after deliberating for less than 3 hours. He was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison with permanent loss of his law enforcement certification. The civil lawsuit Judge Pierce filed resulted in a $4.6 million settlement from the city of Philadelphia, one of the largest ever paid for a wrongful detention. But Pierce made clear the lawsuit wasn't about the money. It was about accountability and exposing a pattern the department had been ignoring for years. Captain Raymond Torres was demoted and eventually forced into early retirement when the investigation revealed he dismissed 9 complaints against Stone over 8 years, all describing the same racial profiling Pierce had experienced. The pattern was documented, flagged multiple times by complainants, and Torres had signed off on every dismissal, claiming the stops were within policy guidelines. The Department of Justice investigation expanded beyond just Stone and Torres, examining Philadelphia PD's entire traffic stop data. The analysis revealed systemic racial disparities in who got stopped, how long stops lasted, and who got searched. The consent decree that followed required comprehensive reforms, mandatory data collection on all stops, automatic review of officers showing statistical bias, civilian oversight of profiling complaints, and termination of supervisors who dismiss valid complaints without proper investigation. But the legal victories and policy changes didn't erase what happened. Judge Pierce returned to the bench and continued presiding over cases, but the experience changed him in ways settlements couldn't fix. He developed anxiety about routine activities like getting gas or driving, wondering if another officer would see his race before his profession. The handcuff marks on his wrist faded within days. But the memory of standing at a gas station in his judicial robes, being treated like a car thief, stayed with him. The police misconduct case he'd been rushing to hear that morning took on new meaning. He understood on a visceral level what the plaintiffs described when they talked about being profiled and detained despite doing nothing wrong. His rulings in civil rights cases became informed by first-hand experience with how bias can override evidence and common sense. The case became a landmark taught in law schools and policemies. The image of a federal judge in robes being handcuffed at a gas station became a symbol of how racial profiling can be so ingrained that even obvious indicators of legitimacy, judicial robes, credentials, proximity to a courthouse, get dismissed when an officer has decided a black person doesn't belong in an expensive car. Rebecca Chen, the attorney who'd recognized Pierce and documented his release, became a key witness in multiple investigations. Her decision to stop for coffee and her immediate recognition of her judge potentially saved Pierce from being taken to a police station in process before anyone realized the magnitude of the mistake. 3 years later, Pierce still served on the federal bench with distinction, using his platform to push for criminal justice reform and speaking at conferences about his experience. The settlement money funded legal aid organizations, helping people who'd experienced similar profiling but didn't have his resources or platform to fight back. Stone served 18 months in prison and was released to a life where he'd never work in law enforcement again. Torres lost his pension benefits and his reputation. The Philadelphia Police Department implemented real reforms that created accountability for officers who showed patterns of racial bias. But on mornings when Pierce stopped for gas on his way to the courthouse, he still felt a flutter of anxiety when he saw patrol cars. He still carried multiple forms of identification beyond what any person should need. He still second-guessed wearing his judicial robes outside the courthouse. Knowing they'd been dismissed as a costume by an officer who couldn't see past his skin color, the accountability was unprecedented and the reforms were comprehensive. Stone went to prison, policies changed, and the case became a teaching moment about the consequences of racial profiling. But Pierce carried the knowledge that his 22 years on the federal bench, his judicial robes, and his proximity to the courthouse where he worked meant nothing to an officer whose bias was stronger than evidence. He'd won every legal battle and achieved systemic change that protected others from similar treatment. But the cost was personal and lasting. The experience of being handcuffed at a gas station 3 blocks from his own courtroom, of having his profession dismissed as a lie and his judicial attire mocked as costume, of learning that even a federal judgeship couldn't shield him from being seen as a threat first and a person second, judicial robes reduced to a costume. A federal judge handcuffed at a gas station, racial bias so deep it couldn't recognize authority standing right in front of it. Share this if you believe credentials should matter more than skin color. Subscribe to Bodycam Protocol for stories where justice was served, but the scars remain. Drop a comment. How do we stop bias from overriding obvious truth? Until next time.